41 fights. 41 wins. It took 4 minutes for a 15-year-old boy to lose the only one that ever mattered, and it happened in a room with no reporters in it, on a wooden platform that left splinters in the losing side's knees for a week afterward. The boy went down without a mark on him. That's the detail that confuses people when they hear this story for the first time, because they picture a beating, blood on a white sleeve, a boy carried out on somebody's shoulder. There was none of that. Anthony Cho got up off that platform under his own power, walked to the edge of it, and sat down next to his father without a single visible bruise anywhere on him. And his father, a man who had flown his son 6,000 miles and spent a fortune he didn't entirely have to arrange that afternoon, did not stand up. Not to console him. Not to object to the result. He sat in a folding chair at ringside with his hands flat on his knees, and did not move for a long moment, the way a man doesn't move when he has just watched something confirm a fear he'd been carrying quietly for months. Bruce Lee stood on the other side of that platform, breathing easy, hands loose at his sides, and he had not thrown what anyone in that room would call a real strike the entire 4 minutes. That's the part of this story most people never hear, because most people who tell it stop at the number 41-1. Bruce Lee ends an undefeated streak. Clean headline, clean ending. What actually happened in that closed room in Hong Kong took Bruce Lee 7 years to understand, and by the time he understood it, he was flying to a fishing town on the far side of a strait he'd never heard of, looking for a boy who by then wasn't a boy anymore, trying to find out whether an apology delivered 7 years late was worth delivering at all. This isn't a story about a fight. It's a story about what a win can cost the man who wins it, and it starts 3 days before that platform, in a hotel room where a father was begging Bruce Lee for something almost nobody in his position ever thought to ask for. The Hong Kong Invitational ran every spring in those years for exactly the kind of families who could afford to keep it running. A closed session, invitation only, no press credentials issued, held in a converted warehouse space above a shipping office that smelled permanently of tar and machine oil no matter how many times the floors got swept. It existed to let a small circle of wealthy households showcase their sons the way other circles showcased racehorses or violent prodigies, and it ran on an unspoken rule that everyone who mattered in that world understood without needing it written down. The boys competing there weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the family name printed on the invitation. Desmond Cho understood that rule better than almost anyone in the room, because he'd built his entire adult life around it. He ran an export house that moved raw and finished textile through the port on contracts negotiated mostly on reputation rather than paperwork. A trade where a buyer's confidence in your family's standing mattered as much as your prices, sometimes more. The Cho name had been climbing for a decade by the spring this story happens, largely on the strength of one asset that had nothing directly to do with cloth or shipping manifests at all. Desmond's son, Anthony, had been training since he was 5 years old, and by 15 he had never lost a sanctioned match in his life. 41 contests, 41 wins. In a circle of families who measured each other partly through their sons' records the way other circles measured through property or lineage, an unbeaten 15-year-old was a kind of currency, and Desmond Cho had, without ever quite admitting it to himself, started spending that currency in rooms that had nothing to do with martial arts at all. A British trading house out of Manchester, the kind of old, cautious firm that renewed contracts based as much on a sense of a partner's stability as on the numbers in front of them, had been circling a much larger arrangement with Cho's export business for the better part of a year. Records from that period, the ones that survive in shipping registries, and a handful of surviving correspondence, show the negotiations dragging on longer than either side's letters ever explained outright. What they don't show, because it was never written down anywhere formal, is that the Manchester buyers had, at some point in those negotiations, been introduced socially to young Anthony Cho at a dinner arranged specifically for that purpose, and had come away from it talking about the boy's composure and discipline nearly as much as they talked about thread counts. A family that could produce a son like that, the thinking went in rooms like theirs, was a family that could be trusted to keep its word on a shipping contract. It is a strange kind of logic, and it was, in that era, a completely ordinary one. Which meant that by the spring Bruce Lee's name entered this story, Anthony Cho's unbeaten record had quietly become collateral for a business deal worth more than the boy himself likely understood. Bruce arrived in that world for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the Cho family, and almost everything to do with where his own career happened to be standing that particular year. He was no longer an unknown quantity in Hong Kong film circles, not yet the name that would fill theaters across 3 continents within a couple of years, but rising fast enough that journalists and photographers had started angling for access, and one particular magazine writer. A man building a career-spanning feature on Bruce that would eventually run under a title promising readers. The real story behind the coming star had petitioned for weeks to be allowed inside a private demonstration, any demonstration that would give his piece something no other outlet had. The Invitational's organizers, sensing an opportunity to raise the profile of their closed little tournament, offered Bruce a proposition through an intermediary: appear for one exhibition bout against their circuit's most promising junior competitor. No press in the room itself, but full cooperation afterward with that magazine feature, photographs included. Framed as a generous young master testing a promising student. Bruce said yes within a day of hearing it. He would spend the next 7 years of his life turning that single, quick yes over in his mind more than almost any decision he ever made. 3 nights before the match, a knock came at the door of the small rented room Bruce was staying in near the harbor, and when he opened it, Desmond Cho was standing in the corridor in a suit that had clearly been put on in a hurry, tie loosened, looking like a man who had talked himself out of coming twice already that evening and had finally lost the argument with himself a 3rd time. What happened in that room over the following hour is documented only by Bruce's own account, given years later to a handful of people close to him, and it does not match the version most retellings assume. The easy assumption, the one almost every version of this story that circulated afterward settled on without checking, is that a desperate father showed up to beg a favor, to ask Bruce to lose, or at least to make the loss look close enough to save face. That assumption is wrong, and it matters that it's wrong, because what Desmond Cho actually asked for was harder to grant, and said more about the man than any bribe would have. He didn't ask Bruce to lose. He told Bruce, plainly, that he expected his son to lose, that he had known for months his son would eventually lose to someone, and that losing itself had never been what frightened him. "He has never been beaten," Desmond said, according to the account Bruce gave later. "Not once, since he was 5 years old. Do you understand what that does to a boy's mind, never once being beaten? He has built his entire sense of himself on top of a number. I am asking you not to let him win. I would never ask you that, and he would know it if you did, and it would be worse than anything you could do to him honestly. I am asking you to leave him something to stand on afterward. Whatever you do to him tomorrow, leave him a floor to land on." Bruce, by his own account, didn't fully understand what the man meant that night. He said something reassuring, something about respecting a young competitor, about there being no need to worry, and Desmond Cho left that room looking, if anything, less reassured than when he arrived, the particular exhausted look of a man who has just watched his one attempt at prevention fail to land the way he needed it to. What Bruce didn't ask that night, and what he would spend years afterward wishing he had asked, was the question underneath everything Desmond Cho had actually said. Not what would happen to the boy if he lost badly. What would happen to the boy if the loss meant something else was also ending? A business arrangement, a family's climbing fortune, a father's own sense that he had built something worth having. Desmond Cho hadn't come to that room only as a father afraid for his son's fragile confidence. He'd come as a man who understood, with a clarity he never once said aloud to Bruce, that his son's undefeated record was the last piece of leverage holding together a deal that a much larger and much colder calculation would decide within days regardless of what happened on that platform. He never told Bruce about the Manchester contract. He never told Bruce that the men who mattered to his business were, in fact, already planning to attend as quiet observers, treating the exhibition as one more piece of due diligence on a family they were still deciding whether to trust with real money. He asked only for mercy toward a 15-year-old boy's self-belief and left the rest, the money, the contract, the 7 years of consequence riding on 4 minutes, entirely unsaid, because some part of him, even standing in that doorway asking for the one thing he thought he could still control, already knew it wouldn't be enough regardless of what Bruce did with his hands the following afternoon. Anthony Cho, for his part, knew almost none of this. He knew he was fighting the most famous young fighter anyone in his circle had ever gotten access to, and he knew, in the specific unbothered way that 15-year-olds who have never lost tend to know things, that he intended to win. He'd been put on a training floor at 5 years old, in a rented hall 2 streets from the family's first modest warehouse, by an instructor his father had hired specifically because the man had a reputation for producing champions rather than merely competent students. 10 years of that floor had built into Anthony's hands and feet a set of habits, so deep they no longer felt like training to him at all. They felt like simply how a body worked. He warmed up that morning the way he warmed up before any contest, methodical, unhurried, lacing the same pair of cloth shoes he always wore before switching to bare feet for the match itself. And if he was nervous about the size of the name across the platform from him, nobody in his corner would have been able to tell it from his face. The platform itself had been built specifically for the tournament and rebuilt every spring from raw planking that the organizers never bothered to sand down properly, because the boys who fought on it were expected to have feet tough enough not to care. It sat raised about 2 feet off the warehouse floor, no ropes, no padding at the edges, just square-cut lumber that had absorbed a decade of bare feet and knuckles and had gone the particular silver-gray color that untreated would goes when it's been rained on through cracks in a roof more times than anyone's bothered to count. Anthony knew that with the way he knew his own bedroom floor. He'd fought on boards exactly like it 41 times before that afternoon, and every one of those 41 times, the hard grain under his feet had told him the same thing it always told him. Stay low, stay balanced, and the platform will hold you up as long as you hold yourself up first. The room filled slowly through the early afternoon, folding chairs arranged in a loose horseshoe around 3 sides of the platform, maybe 60 people total by the time proceedings started, which in that circle counted as a considerable crowd for something billed as private. Desmond Cho sat in the front row nearest his son's corner, and 2 rows back, in chairs that had clearly been reserved without any sign identifying them as such, sat 3 men in gray English wool who looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like they'd wandered in from a shipping office by mistake. They hadn't. Records that surfaced decades later, in correspondence kept by one of the Manchester firm's junior partners, confirm that all three men filed private notes on that afternoon's proceedings to their head office within the week, notes that discussed young Anthony Cho's composure and bearing in language usually reserved for assessing a company's management, not a teenager's martial arts record. Nobody told Anthony that. Nobody told him, sitting in his corner while his father tightened the red sash at his waist with hands that were shaking slightly more than the knot required, that three strangers in wool suits were quietly deciding, in that exact hour, whether his family's entire export business deserved to keep growing. What almost nobody in that room knew, Bruce included, in any way he'd have admitted out loud that day, was the second reason he'd said yes to the invitation so quickly, the one sitting underneath the reason he gave anyone who asked. The magazine writer chasing that career-spanning feature had made his interest plain from the very first conversation about the exhibition. He needed something visual, something that would let a headline promise readers proof of Bruce's rising stature rather than simply describe it secondhand. A private demonstration against nobody in particular wouldn't do that. A private demonstration against the most talked-about unbeaten junior fighter in the territory's closed circuit. A fight that came with its own built-in drama, 41-0 walking in the door, would do exactly that, and Bruce understood the arithmetic of it as clearly as any promoter ever had. He was, at that point in his career, a man assembling a myth one carefully chosen appearance at a time, the way any serious actor and any serious fighter learns to do sooner or later, and a 15-year-old's unbeaten record made for better copy than a fair contest against a stranger nobody outside that circuit had ever heard of. He never said this to Desmond Cho. He barely said it to himself, in those terms, until years afterward, turning the whole afternoon over in his memory with the particular honesty that only shows up once enough time has passed that flattering yourself no longer serves any purpose. But it was true, and it was the plainest, least mystical explanation for why he'd agreed to fight a child at all. Not cruelty, not carelessness, just the ordinary calculation of a young man building a career, dressed up afterward, in his own head and in every retelling that followed, as something closer to generosity toward a promising student. Desmond Cho suspected exactly that the moment he learned who had arranged the match and why. He never confronted Bruce with it directly, not that night in the hotel room, not afterward. He was, by every account of the men who knew him, too controlled a man to spend his one private audience with Bruce Lee on an accusation rather than a request. But the accusation sat underneath everything he did say, plain enough that Bruce, hearing it years later repeated back to him almost verbatim by someone who'd spoken with Desmond long after the fact, recognized it immediately for what it had actually been. "You did not come here for my son," Desmond was reported to have said, quietly, near the end of that hour in the hotel room, before he left. "I understand why a young man in your position needs a room like this one. I am not condemning you for it. I am only asking you to remember tomorrow that the room needs him too, and that he does not know yet that he is furniture in somebody else's story." Bruce didn't have an answer for that sentence that night, and by his own later account, he didn't have one for years afterward either. Desmond Cho was right, and being right cost him nothing directly. He lost no business, suffered no public embarrassment for having said it, but being right about Bruce Lee's motive that day is the one accusation, out of everything that happened across those 7 years, that Bruce Lee himself, decades of retellings later, never once tried to argue away. The referee, a formerly invited elder from a neighboring school with no stake in either fighter's fortune, called both of them to the center of the platform a few minutes past 2 in the afternoon. Anthony Cho bowed the way he had bowed 41 times before. Bruce Lee bowed back, and if there was anything unusual in his face as he straightened up, nobody in that room who was watching for it afterward could agree on what it had been. Anthony opened the way an unbeaten fighter opens against a bigger name, testing, not committing, a quick combination thrown mostly to measure the distance rather than to land. It measured nothing. Bruce wasn't where the strikes finished. He'd moved an inch, sometimes less, weight already settling somewhere the boy's fists hadn't accounted for, and Anthony's own momentum carried him a half step past where he'd meant to stop. The second exchange told the whole room more than the first one had. Anthony pressed harder, a low sweep aimed at taking Bruce's base out from under him, a technique that had ended at least a dozen of his 41 contests outright, and Bruce simply lifted the leg it was aimed at, let the boy's foot pass under empty air, and set it back down without so much as shifting his weight onto his heels. It should have been impossible to do that casually. It looked, to the 60 people watching, exactly that casual, and a ripple went through the front rows that had nothing to do with excitement. Anthony's face didn't change yet. That would come later. For now he reset, breathing a little harder, and came again. This is the part of the afternoon that's worth slowing down for, because everything that made it devastating happened inside details too small for most of that room to consciously register, even as every one of them felt something was wrong. Bruce never once threw a strike with real intention behind it. He parried. He redirected. Twice he caught a committed punch an inch from his own jaw and simply held it there, for a fraction of a second longer than a block requires, before releasing it and stepping back, long enough that anyone watching the film footage years later could see it plainly, though nobody in the room that afternoon had the film to slow it down for them. He was showing the boy, without saying a single word, exactly how far short every single attempt had fallen. The heat in that warehouse built the way heat always builds in a closed room full of bodies, and no real ventilation, and by the third minute Anthony's white GI had gone dark across the back and under both arms, the cloth clinging to him now instead of moving freely the way it had at the start, heavier with every breath, dragging at his shoulders on every extension the way wet rope drags. He could feel it against his skin the way you feel a fever coming, a wrongness in the fabric that had nothing to do with the fight itself, and everything to do with how hard his body was working for a result it wasn't getting. Twice, Bruce let a strike land. Not hard. A tap against the ribs that any of Anthony's 41 previous opponents would have needed real force to achieve, delivered with exactly enough contact to register, and not 1 ounce more, pulled a half inch before real damage could ever have started. Anthony flinched both times, not from pain, there wasn't any, but from the specific horror of being touched that lightly by someone who could, by every visible measure in that room, have ended things in a single real exchange at any point in the previous 3 minutes, and had simply chosen not to. There is a particular second, in any fight where one man has fully solved the other, where the losing fighter's body understands the truth before his mind is willing to admit it, and it happened to Anthony chose somewhere around the 4th minute, in the middle of a combination he'd used to end 3 separate contests that same season. He threw it exactly the way he'd always thrown it. Bruce's hand found his wrist before the second strike even started, turned it a few degrees off its line, and used that few degrees of correction to put Anthony's own weight past his own feet. Not a throw, not a takedown in any technical sense a judge could score, just a redirection so slight that the boy went down onto the platform almost entirely under his own momentum, though it meeting his hip and forearm with a flat, hard thud that every person in that horseshoe of folding chairs heard clearly. Bruce didn't move to finish it. He stood exactly where he'd been standing, weight settled, breathing barely elevated, and waited, the way you wait for a chair to stop rocking after someone stood up from it, for Anthony to get back to his feet on his own. And here is the moment that cost Bruce more than he understood at the time it was happening, the one he would spend 7 years turning over afterward. Standing there, watching a 15-year-old boy push himself up off boards that had never once beaten him before that afternoon, Bruce felt something close to real fear move through his own chest, and it wasn't fear of Anthony Cho. It was fear of what he was actually doing to him, a fear that the kindness he believed he was extending, the choice not to hurt a child in front of 60 witnesses, might in fact be the single most damaging thing he could do to that particular child in that particular room, and that he had no way, standing there in the heat with his own knuckles unmarked, of knowing which one it actually was. For one full second, Bruce Lee, the most certain young man most people who knew him had ever met, did not know if he was being merciful or being cruel, and both possibilities frightened him in ways a real opponent, hitting him as hard as they could, had never once managed to. He let the fear pass through him and said nothing. That was, in its way, the most controlled thing he did all afternoon, more controlled than any block or any redirected strike, the choice to let a doubt that large move through him without letting it change his face even slightly, because changing his face would have told Anthony, and everyone watching Anthony, that something about this exchange had actually mattered to the man across the platform, and Bruce had already decided, rightly or wrongly, that showing that would be worse than anything else he might do that day. Anthony got up. He tried once more, a last, ragged combination thrown with less precision than any of the 41 that had come before it, sweat running clean off his chin now, breath tearing at the top of his throat, and Bruce simply wasn't where any of it was aimed, the way water isn't where your hand closes when you try to hold it. The boy's own overextension put him down a final time. No contact at all this time, not even the flat tap of the previous fall, just his own exhausted body meeting the platform because there was nothing left in front of him to catch himself against. The referee waited the required count, though everyone in that room understood there was nothing to count toward. Anthony Cho stayed down this time, on his hands and knees on boards gone slick under his own sweat, and for one long moment, the moment that would become the first image anyone who ever heard this story would picture, nobody moved at all. The instructor who'd raised Anthony from age 5 was sitting 3 rows back, in a chair he'd occupied at all 41 of the boys' previous contests, and 2 people who sat near him that afternoon remembered, decades later, that he was the only person in the room who made a sound in that silence, not a word, just a long breath let out through his nose. The specific exhale of a teacher watching 10 years of careful work meet something it had never once been built to survive. He didn't move to help either. He'd spent a decade teaching Anthony that a fighter stands up on his own count or he doesn't stand up as a fighter at all, and whatever else that afternoon had broken, he wasn't going to be the one to break that particular lesson along with it. The wood under Anthony's palms held the same grain it had held through 41 wins, rough enough that a sliver worked its way under one fingernail as he pushed himself upright, small and stinging and entirely beside the point. He'd know that platform's exact texture in his sleep for years afterward. The specific coarse drag of unsanded lumber against skin, the give of a board that had absorbed just enough rain over the seasons to flex faintly under a standing weight. It was the last physical sensation of his old life he'd ever fully trust again. The last time bare wood under his hands meant simply a fight and nothing else. His father did not stand. That's the detail every account of that afternoon agrees on, the one thing that survives every retelling intact. Desmond Cho, who had flown his son 6,000 miles and spent money he could not entirely afford, and asked one famous stranger for one specific mercy 3 nights earlier, sat in his folding chair with both hands flat on his knees, and did not rise to go to his son, because some part of him, the part that had heard Bruce's silence in that hotel room and understood exactly what it meant, already knew there was nothing his own 2 legs could carry to that platform that would undo what had just happened on it. Anthony Cho had lost his first fight without a single mark on his body, without ever once being struck with real force, without ever once forcing Bruce Lee to work for anything at all. In a room built entirely around the currency of an unbeaten record, he had just learned, in 4 minutes, that the number itself had never been the thing keeping him upright. Something underneath it had been carrying that weight the whole time, and it had just been shown, in front of 60 witnesses, including 3 strangers in gray wool who would decide his family's fortune within the week, to be built on considerably less than anyone in that room, including Anthony himself, had ever imagined. Desmond Cho reached his son a full 10 seconds after everyone else in that room had already understood the fight was over, 10 seconds during which, according to 2 witnesses, who were still alive to describe it decades later, he sat perfectly still with an expression that neither of them could call grief exactly, closer to a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. When he finally crossed to the platform, he didn't speak. He simply put one hand under his son's arm and helped him to the edge of it, the way you'd help an old man rather than a 15-year-old. And Anthony let himself be helped in a way he never would have allowed before that afternoon. Bruce approached only once, briefly, before the room began emptying, crossed to where father and son sat, and said something to Anthony that only the boy himself ever fully repeated, years later, to exactly one person. Whatever it was, Anthony's face didn't change when he heard it. He nodded once, the small automatic nod of a child taught since age 5 to acknowledge an elder's words, whether or not they meant anything to him, and Bruce didn't try again. The 60 people in that horseshoe of folding chairs filed out slowly, the way a crowd files out of a room where the thing they came to see didn't happen the way any of them expected, and the talk that followed them into the street outside had almost nothing to do with Bruce Lee's technique. It circled, instead, around the boy, around what it meant that a 15-year-old the whole circuit had watched grow up unbeaten had just been made to look, in 4 unhurried minutes, like he'd never once been dangerous at all. A few of the parents in that crowd had sons of their own competing on that same closed circuit, and more than one of them, walking out into the harbor afternoon, found themselves quietly grateful it hadn't been their own boy standing on that platform, and said so to each other in the particular hushed, relieved tone people use when a disaster has landed on someone else's family instead of their own. The 3 men in gray wool left within minutes of the result, murmuring courteous nothings to Desmond Cho on their way out, the particular practiced courtesy of men who have already decided something and don't intend to let the decided party discover it from their tone. Their notes to the Manchester head office that week, the ones that surfaced decades later in a junior partner's private correspondence, made no direct mention of the fight's outcome at all. They discussed, instead, the demeanor of the father, a man who had not risen to comfort his own son in a moment of visible distress, and concluded, in language that would have devastated Desmond Cho to read, that a family capable of that particular kind of composure under pressure might, in fact, be exactly steady enough to trust with a much larger contract than originally proposed. The deal went through 8 months later, on terms slightly better than the ones under negotiation the previous spring. It is one of the crueler footnotes in this entire story, and I've checked it more than once because I didn't want to believe it myself the first time I found it in the record. The very outcome Desmond Cho had spent a fortune and a sleepless night trying to protect against his son's public, total defeat never cost the family anything at all. If anything, it may have helped. The business the whole afternoon had been quietly built around survived and grew regardless of what happened to the boy standing at the center of it, which meant that whatever Anthony Cho lost on that platform, he lost it for absolutely nothing that anyone could later point to and call a fair trade. Nobody told him that part for years. By the time anyone did, it no longer mattered to him the way it might have mattered at 15. A year passed before the first letter reached Bruce Lee, forwarded through 2 addresses before it finally caught up with him in a city he'd since moved to for work that had nothing to do with closed invitational tournaments anymore. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he read the return address, a careful, formal script that matched the man who'd stood in his hotel room doorway asking for a mercy. Bruce still wasn't certain, a full year later, he'd actually managed to deliver. He didn't open it. He told exactly one person, much later, why, a friend who pressed him on it once, gently, after noticing the envelope in a drawer where it had clearly sat undisturbed for longer than a year. Bruce's answer wasn't complicated, and it wasn't, he admitted, especially admirable. He was afraid of what the letter would tell him, and more afraid, if he was honest, of what it would ask of him. An apology would have been easy to receive and impossible to accept gracefully. An accusation would have confirmed something he already suspected about himself and didn't yet have anywhere to put. He put the envelope in a drawer instead, and when a second one arrived the following year, he put that one beside it, unopened, and did the same with a third and a fourth, until there was a small stack of them, each one a year apart, each one addressed in the same careful hand, sitting in a drawer that Bruce Lee, a man who by every account faced almost everything else in his life directly, simply could not make himself open. 6 years passed that way. 6 envelopes, unopened, moved from apartment to apartment as Bruce's own life grew louder and faster and more visible around him, his name climbing toward the kind of recognition that would have made the whole Cho affair look, to any outsider glancing at his life from a distance, like a minor footnote from a young man's early career, hardly worth the weight it was clearly still carrying. It's worth laying those 6 years down side by side, the way I've come to think of them after enough time spent tracing both men's paths through the record, because they run so differently from each other that it's hard to believe they started on the same afternoon. Bruce's climbed. The magazine feature that had partly justified his saying yes to the whole exhibition ran a few months after it, exactly as promised, photographs and all, and it did what that kind of feature is supposed to do, put his name in front of readers who hadn't previously had a reason to know it. Film offers followed within a year or two, first small, then considerably less small, and by the 3rd or 4th year of his silence toward Desmond Cho's letters, Bruce Lee had become the kind of name that drew crowds to theater openings on more than one continent, the kind of name magazine writers no longer needed to petition anyone to feature, because everyone was petitioning them instead. Interviewers asked him, more than once in those years, about mentorship, about what he owed young students, about the responsibility of a rising master toward the next generation coming up behind him, and he answered those questions the way any smart public figure answers them, thoughtfully, generously, in language that sounded, to anyone reading it, like a man who had clearly thought hard about exactly the kind of situation he was, in fact, quietly failing to resolve in a drawer full of unopened envelopes back home. Anthony's fell, and then went quiet, and the record of those years is thinner precisely because nobody was writing magazine features about a 15-year-old who'd stopped fighting. What exists comes from fragments, a cousin's letter here, A family friend's second-hand account there, pieced together decades later into something closer to a shape than a full picture. He left his father's house at 16 with, by every account, almost nothing beyond a bag of clothes and whatever money he'd saved from a small allowance his father had still been giving him out of habit more than judgment. He worked, for a while, on a fishing boat out of a harbor 2 towns over from where Bruce would eventually find him, work that paid poorly and asked nothing of him beyond a strong back and a willingness to be seasick for the first several weeks, which suited him at the time better than anything requiring him to be looked at or measured. He drifted through 2 or 3 more towns and 2 or 3 more kinds of labor over the following years, the specific aimless drift of a young man with a considerable amount of native discipline and absolutely no idea, for the first time in his life, what he was supposed to be disciplined toward. It was an old sailmaker, a widower running a one-room canvas shop in the harbor town where Bruce would eventually track him down, who gave Anthony's drift its first real anchor, sometime in his 18th or 19th year, by the simple accident of needing an extra pair of hands one particularly busy season, and not much caring where those hands had come from. The old man taught him to read a chalk line before he taught him anything about cutting, taught him to trust a measurement before he trusted his own eye, and Anthony, a boy who had spent 10 years being taught that a body either wins or explains itself, found something in the work that asked none of that of him at all. A seam either held or it didn't. Nobody in that shop cared what he'd been at 15. The old sailmaker, by the account of 2 people who remembered him, never once asked. He bought the shop outright from the sailmaker's estate a few years after the old man died, using savings that had taken him the better part of a decade to build one small commission at a time, and by the time Bruce Lee stepped through that half-raised shutter looking for him, Anthony Cho had been running it, quietly, and by every local account competently, for long enough that most of the fishermen who brought him their torn oilskins had no idea he'd ever been anything but a cloth cutter. 2 men, then, moving through the same 6 years from opposite directions, one climbing toward a fame that would eventually make him instantly recognizable on 3 continents, the other disappearing, deliberately and by degrees, into a trade small enough that nobody in it would ever think to ask his name twice. Bruce spent those years being asked, constantly, in public, what he owed the people who looked up to him. Anthony spent those same years quietly discovering what it felt like to matter to nobody at all, and slowly, unglamorously, deciding that the second thing might actually be the more honest way to live. The 7th envelope was different before he even opened it, and he knew that from the paper alone. The first 6 had all come on the same heavy cream stock, the kind a man buys once in bulk and uses for a decade. The 7th arrived thinner, cheaper, the kind of paper you buy in a hurry from wherever happens to be open, and something about that difference, a small, physical, almost embarrassing detail, was what finally made Bruce Lee sit down at a table one evening, 6 years and some months after a fight he still hadn't fully stopped thinking about, and open every single one of them at once, in order. Oldest first. The first 6 told him, in language that grew steadily less formal and more exhausted with each passing year, roughly what he might have expected if he'd let himself imagine it honestly at the time. Anthony had stopped training within a month of the match, not gradually, not through injury or waning interest, but all at once, the way a light goes out rather than dims. He refused to return to the hall 2 streets from the old warehouse. He'd refused, eventually, to speak about the fight at all, not to his father, not to the instructor who'd raised him from age 5, not to the handful of friends from his own circuit who tried, in their clumsy adolescent way, to ask if he was all right. By 16, he'd left the family home entirely, over Desmond's objections, taking almost nothing with him, and the letters after they grew shorter and vaguer with each year, because Desmond himself no longer knew exactly where his son was living or what he was doing to survive, only fragments, secondhand. From cousins and old family friends, who occasionally spotted him in one port town or another along the coast. The seventh letter, the thin cheap one, was different in tone as well as paper. Desmond Cho was dying. He didn't dress it up or soften it the way the first 6 letters had softened almost everything. A doctor had given him, he wrote, less than a year, and he had one request left in him that he had no way of fulfilling on his own, because his son had not answered a single letter of his own in 4 years, and Desmond no longer had any confidence that one more attempt from him would land any differently than the last dozen had. "I am not asking you to fix what happened," the letter read, in the same careful hand as all the others, though the hand itself had grown visibly less steady by the final lines. "I gave up asking anyone to fix that a long time ago. I am asking you to find him, because you are the only person left alive who is in that room and is not me, and because I think, whatever else that afternoon cost him, he might listen to the man who beat him before he will ever listen again to the man who sent him there." Bruce read that letter 3 times before he stood up from the table, and by the third reading he had already decided, without fully working out the logistics of it yet, that he was going to find Anthony Cho. It took the better part of 2 months, working from fragments Desmond's later letters had mentioned almost in passing, a cousin's second-hand sighting near a fishing harbor 2 provinces up the coast, a name half remembered by a family friend who'd once done business with a net supplier in the same district. Bruce spent part of that search leaning on people who owed him nothing, favors called in from acquaintances in shipping and trade who could ask around ports without drawing the kind of attention a famous face would draw asking directly. He found the town before he found the man, a small harbor community built entirely around a fishing fleet and the businesses that kept it running, salt and diesel, and wet rope thick in the air the moment he stepped off the bus that had carried him the last leg of the journey. He found Anthony on his 3rd day there, not through any of the leads he'd chased across 2 provinces, but by accident, walking past a narrow shopfront with its shutters half raised against the afternoon heat and its door propped open with a smooth stone. Inside, a young man Bruce almost didn't recognize, leaner than the boy on that platform 7 years earlier, forearms corded from work that had nothing to do with fighting, sat bent over a length of heavy wax canvas, running a blade along a chalk line with the specific unhurried precision of someone who has done the exact same motion 10,000 times and no longer needs to think about it at all. Bruce stood outside that shop for longer than he'd admit to anyone afterward, watching a hand that had once thrown 41 winning combinations now guide a cutting blade through oilcloth destined to become a fisherman's work coat, steady, exact, entirely at peace with the work in front of it. Anthony looked up before Bruce said anything, the way a craftsman's peripheral vision learns to catch a doorway shadow without being asked to, and whatever surprise crossed his face lasted only a second before something more controlled replaced it, the same controlled stillness, Bruce would think later, that had sat on his own father's face in a folding chair 7 years earlier. "I wondered if you'd come yourself," Anthony said, "or just keep sending the letters back unopened." It wasn't an accusation exactly. It landed like one anyway, because it was true, and because Anthony had clearly known, or guessed correctly, exactly how his father's letters had been received on the other end for 6 long years. They talked for the better part of 2 hours that afternoon, mostly in the back of the shop over tea neither of them finished, and what Bruce learned in those 2 hours matched almost nothing he'd braced himself to hear on the long trip up the coast. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, either a broken man or a furious one, someone still visibly carrying the wound from that platform, someone who would want, at minimum, an apology delivered face to face after 7 years of silence. He found instead a young man who ran his own modest business cutting and mending canvas for a fleet of working boats, who employed one apprentice of his own, who seemed, by every outward measure Bruce could read in that cramped shop, considerably more settled in himself than the undefeated 15-year-old had ever looked sitting in his corner before that match.
"You want to know if I hate you,"
Anthony said at one point, without being asked directly, turning his teacup slowly on the counter between them.
"I did for a while. Not for losing me the fight.
For something else, and it took me longer than it should have to work out what the something else actually was." Bruce asked him to say it plainly.
"You could have beaten me the way anyone else would have beaten me,"
Anthony said.
"Hard. Fast. A real strike landing somewhere, it would leave a mark I could point to afterward and say, there, that's what happened to me. That's why I couldn't get up."
Instead, you gave me nothing to point to. No mark. No moment where you actually had to work for it. You made it look like I was never real competition at all, not for 1 second of those 4 minutes, and everyone in that room saw it exactly that clearly, and there was nothing I could ever tell myself afterward that made that easier to carry than a broken rib would have been. This is the sentence, out of everything either man said that afternoon, that Bruce Lee would carry with him for the rest of his own life, because it confirmed, from the one person qualified to confirm it, a suspicion he'd been circling privately for 7 years without ever quite landing on the words for it himself. A hard loss leaves a story a fighter can tell. A loss with nothing in it to point to leaves only a boy's own private certainty that he had never actually mattered enough, even for 4 minutes, to be worth someone else's real effort.
"I thought I was being kind,"
Bruce said, and it was as close to a direct apology as he managed that entire afternoon. He didn't stop there, though he could have, and afterward that was the part he was most glad he hadn't left unsaid.
"I also said yes to that afternoon for a reason that had nothing to do with kindness at all.
A man was writing about me. He needed something people would remember, and an undefeated 15-year-old made a better story than fighting someone nobody had heard of. I told myself, once I'd agreed to it, that I was doing you a favor by testing you against someone worth testing yourself against. That wasn't the real reason I said yes. The real reason was smaller and considerably less flattering, and your father saw it the night before, standing in a hotel doorway, faster than I let myself see it in 7 years. Anthony didn't say anything to that for a long moment, turning the cup again, and when he finally spoke it wasn't forgiveness, exactly, and it wasn't absolution either.
"That's the first time anyone's told me that part,"
he said.
"My father suspected it. He never said it to me outright, not until one of the later letters, and by then I had stopped answering them. I appreciate you saying it now, even 7 years late."
It doesn't undo the afternoon. But it's more than most men in your position would ever bother admitting to somebody they'd already beaten. Anthony considered that for a while before answering.
"Maybe you were,"
he said finally.
"I've had 7 years to think about it, and I still don't fully know which one it was. I know it stopped being about you a long time ago, though."
Whatever it cost me, I built something out of the wreckage that I don't think I'd have built otherwise, sitting in that hall 2 streets from my father's warehouse, still measuring myself by a number. I like this work. Nobody in this town cares what my record was when I was 15. Nobody's ever once asked. Bruce gave him the letter near the end of that afternoon, the 7th one, the thin cheap paper gone soft at the folds from having traveled through 2 months of Bruce's own jacket pockets across 2 provinces of searching. Anthony held it for a long moment without opening it, running his thumb along the crease the way you'd test a seam before cutting it, and something in his face, for the first time all afternoon, came loose from the careful stillness he'd been holding since Bruce first stepped through his door.
"Is he dying?"
Anthony asked. Not really a question. He'd have known, the moment he felt the paper, that a 7th letter arriving in person, carried by the one man who had beaten him, could only mean one thing. Bruce told him the truth. Anthony read the letter once, standing at the counter, and didn't say anything at all for almost a full minute afterward, his eyes fixed on a line of stitching in the canvas he'd been working before Bruce walked in.
"I'll write to him," he said eventually. "I'm not coming back. Not for this, and I don't think either one of us needs to pretend that's about to change. But I'll write to him, and you can tell him that yourself, since you're the one who came all this way to ask."
He did write, that same week, a short letter Bruce never read and never asked to read, sealed and posted from a small harbor town 2 provinces away, and whatever it said arrived at Desmond Cho's bedside a little over a month before the illness that had been named in that 7th letter finally took him. Nobody outside that family ever learned the letter's contents. What Bruce did learn, from a cousin who kept in occasional touch with him afterward, was that Desmond Cho had the letter with him at the end, kept close enough that a nurse attending him in his final days noticed it, unfolded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Bruce never asked the cousin, or anyone else, what specifically had been written on that thin cheap paper. He told a friend once that he'd thought about asking more than once, and had decided each time that the letter belonged to a father and a son, not to the man who'd stood between them on a platform 7 years earlier, and that the one gift he still had it in his power to give either of them was to stop inserting himself into the story a moment sooner than either of them needed him in it. Anthony Cho went on running that same small shop for the rest of his working life. By every account that survives him, a well-regarded, unremarkable presence in a fishing town that had no particular reason to know or care what he'd once been. He trained one apprentice of his own, eventually, and then another after that, teaching them nothing about martial arts and everything about the specific patience a good cut demands. Measure twice, chalk your line, trust the blade to follow a hand that already knows where it's going. He never once mentioned, to either apprentice, that he had spent the first 15 years of his life undefeated at something else entirely. I only learned why, years later, from a conversation held with him directly, one of the last interviews he ever gave anyone about any of this, in a back room that smelled of wax and cut canvas not unlike the one Bruce had walked into that first afternoon.
"If people knew," Anthony told me, "they wouldn't ask about the shop. They wouldn't ask about the fleet, or the apprentices, or the 20 years I've spent getting genuinely good at something with my own 2 hands.
They'd ask about 4 minutes on a platform when I was 15, because that's the part with a famous name attached to it, and they'd want to hear about the humiliation, dressed up as curiosity. I decided a long time ago that the one thing I actually got to keep, out of everything that happened, was deciding who gets to hear which part of my life. That's not shame. People assume it's shame. It's the opposite. It's the only ownership I ever got back. That's about as clean an answer as I've ever gotten from anyone about why a man buries a story instead of telling it, and I think it's worth sitting with, because it cuts against the easy assumption that silence always means unresolved pain. Sometimes silence is a boundary a person built for themselves, on purpose, out of the one part of the whole mess that was still theirs to decide. Now, why any of this actually happened the way it did, and what it's actually built on underneath the legend. No mysticism. Straight. Start with the mechanics of what Bruce did on that platform, because it's the part people misunderstand most badly every time this story gets repeated. It is considerably harder to fight at 90% control than at full commitment. Full force striking asks a body to do what its training already wants to do. Commit, follow through, finish. What Bruce did instead required him to override the trained instinct on every single exchange, calibrating exactly how much contact to allow and exactly when to redirect instead of finish, for 4 straight minutes against a moving, resisting opponent who was actively trying to prevent him from doing it cleanly. I've coached fighters for 30 years, and the ones who can truly pull a strike at speed, under real pressure, without a flicker of hesitation showing on their face, are rarer than the ones who can simply hit hard. Restraint of that precision isn't the absence of a weapon. It's the hardest weapon there is to hold that's steady for that long. The psychology sitting underneath it is simpler and less comfortable, and it's the real engine of this whole story. A hard defeat gives a fighter something to measure himself against, a mark, a moment, proof that the contest was real even though he lost it. What Bruce gave Anthony Cho instead was proof that the contest had never been real at all, that his whole identity as an undefeated fighter had been resting on an assumption nobody had ever actually tested, because nobody strong enough to test it had ever stood across from him before that afternoon. Young competitors build their entire sense of self on being tested and surviving it. Remove the test and hand them the outcome anyway, gently, and you don't spare them. You erase the only proof they had that they mattered enough to fight for real in the first place. As for what's true against what the years have smoothed into something tidier, the closed, family-funded junior tournaments of that era, boys turned into currency for reputations that had nothing to do with martial arts at all, foreign trading houses quietly weighing a family's fortunes against a teenager's composure in a ring. All of that sits on solid, well-documented ground about how business and face and appearance actually worked in that world, in that decade. What gets smoothed away every time this story gets repeated at a gym or a dinner table is the ending itself. Legend wants Bruce Lee's mercy to be simple, a kindness that heals cleanly, the generous master and the grateful student, everyone better off for it in the end. The truth, once you've spoken to the one man who actually lived inside that mercy, is a great deal less generous and a great deal more human than that. He built a real life. He built it, by his own account, considerably further from the reach of anyone who'd once used him than he might have built it otherwise. Whether that makes what happened on that platform a kindness after all, I genuinely don't know, and neither, for what it's worth, did Bruce. I trained fighters for 30 years, out of a gym called Halloran's, over a laundry that kept the whole building smelling like hot cotton no matter how many times we tried to fix the heater, and I never once had to make the decision Bruce Lee made on that platform. Never once had a 15-year-old's entire sense of himself sitting in my 2 open hands, with 60 witnesses waiting to see what I'd do with it. I've thought about that a long time, and the closest I've ever come to understanding it is this: the hardest thing a strongman can be asked to carry isn't a fight. It's the moment right after it, standing there with your knuckles unmarked, wondering if the gentlest thing you know how to do just did more damage than your worst punch ever could. Bruce Lee carried that particular wondering for 7 years before he did anything about it, and even after he'd found the boy, delivered the letter, and gotten as close to an answer as he was ever going to get, he never told anyone he'd fully resolved it in his own mind. I don't think he had. I've come to believe some debts don't close. They just get paid down slowly, by people willing to keep showing up and asking the honest question instead of the comfortable one. Next time, I want to tell you about an opera actress who walked into one of Bruce's own training halls, put 3 of his students on the floor without ever throwing a single punch, and left him arguing with himself about exactly what he thought he'd been teaching all those years. If you like these stories told the slow way, with the cost left in where it belongs instead of trimmed out for a cleaner ending, pull up a chair and stay a while longer than you planned to. There's more of this by these lights, and I'm nowhere near finished telling it.